Hello everyone, welcome. Welcome subscribers, welcome followers. All right, so 2 days ago, I posted a video about basically sharing with you the fact that I didn't know anything about the history of what was the difference between Zionism and Judaism, and how I came to learn a little bit about it, and I share with you some whatever I knew, which wasn't very much. But I did tell you that I wanted to learn some more, and I show you some books that I was going to read and prepare notes on what I was reading, and share it with you. And indeed I have, and I actually, those books that I showed you in the previous video, I learned enough to know that most of them actually hold this book that I told you about, this old book, as actually quite a reference. They reference it and so on. So I think it's also a better one. So what I did was, this is going to have 3 parts, this talk. I'm sorry, let me get my camera a little bit better. All right, so this talk is going to be in 3 parts because there is so much, really. I want to share with you about Egypt, the early Egypt, because everything is so interconnected. And then Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia was of the Semite race, and basically what it's to the west, okay, and it's basically what today is Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. Now in this Mesopotamia we have the Assyrians, not to be confused with Syria, the Assyrians, which are the north part of Mesopotamia, and that is Iraq, and actually some parts of even Iran, some parts, Kuwait, Syria, and Turkey. Then in the middle, you have, of that mass of land, you have the Babylonians. And in the south of that part, we have the Chaldeans. That is where the city of Ur is, Abraham's birthplace. So when we talk about that, you're going to hear references to the Fertile Crescent, which is really what we call the cradle of civilization. It's the geography is shaped in the form of a crescent, the region. And it is Western Asia, North Africa, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, and so on. Okay, there is so much intertwined with the Hebrews and Palestine and so on that I'm going to start backwards. I'm going to start with the Hebrews, Palestine, and the predecessors of the Hebrews there, and I'm going to name it number 3 because it really is number 3. Then I'm going to go back to the second and do another video with Babylonia and the Chaldeans and Assyrians, yes. And then I'm going to go, so I'm going to do 3, 2, 1, and 1 will be the very early one. We should start with Egypt. so much there, okay? And they're all intertwined and interconnected. But I'm going to start with the Hebrews because it's probably the one that you are at the moment, because of what is happening, most interested in. What I found is that for the Egypt and the Mesopotamia, I could take notes. The chapters are quite long, they're very detailed. So I took notes and I will be posting those videos, okay? For the Hebrews, however, the chapter is actually quite short compared to the other ones. And there is so much here that I thought, actually this one I'm not going to take notes because I don't want to make mistakes here of interpretation. We live in dangerous times. So I'm just going to follow this book. Okay, so I will remind you, it is the Ancient Times, a history of the early world, and it is used as a reference for many historians. And it is by Professor, what is his name? Breasted, but what is his first name? James Henry Breasted, director of the Oriental Institute in the University of Chicago. And it was, this is the second edition of the book. It was first published in 1910, and this is from the 1935 edition. So what I'm going to do, I think it will take about half an hour, but I don't want to make any mistakes of interpretation, so I'll just read it as well as I can, and you can do other things. You don't have to look at me while I am reading it. Okay, so this is how it starts. Chapter 7, Western Asia, the Hebrews, Palestine and the predecessors of the Hebrews there. The home of the Hebrews was on the western end of the Fertile Crescent, in a land now called Palestine. It is the region lying along the southeastern corner of the Mediterranean, a narrow strip between desert and sea, for while the sea limits it on the west, the wastes of the desert bay sweep northward, forming the eastern boundary of Palestine. It was about 150 miles long, and less than 10,000 square miles are included within these limits. That is, Palestine was somewhat larger than the state of Vermont. He's American, so the references are always about America. Okay, tiny. Much of this area is unproductive, for the desert intrudes upon southern Palestine and rolls northward in gaunt and arid limestone hills, even surrounding Jerusalem. The valleys of northern Palestine, however, are rich and productive. The entire land is without summer rains and is dependent upon the winter rainy season for moisture. There is no opportunity for irrigation, and the harvest is therefore scantier than in lands enjoying summer rains. Only the northern end of the Palestinian coast has any harbors, but these were early seized by the Phoenicians. Palestine thus remained cut off from the sea. In natural resources, it was too poor ever to develop prosperity or political power like its great civilized neighbors on the Nile and Euphrates, or in Syria or Phoenicia. Here, at the western end of the Fertile Crescent, as at the eastern end, the Semitic nomads from the desert bay mingled with the dwellers in the northern mountains of the highland zone. The northerners, chiefly early Anatolians, later they will be called Hittites, from Asia Minor and Syria left their marks on the Semites of Palestine. The prominent aquiline nose is still considered to be the mark of the Semite, especially of the Jew, was really a feature belonging to the non-Semitic Anatolians, who intermarried with the people of Palestine and gave them this Anatolian type of face. Strange faces from many a foreign clime crowded the marketplaces of Palestine amid a babel of various languages. Here the rich jewelry, bronze dishes, and ivory furniture of the Nile craftsmen mingled with the pottery of the Aegean islands and of the highland civilization, and with the gay woolens of Babylonia. The donkeys, which lifted their complaining voices above the hubbub of the market, had grazed along the shores of both Nile and Euphrates, and their masters had trafficked beneath the Babylonian tower temples as well as under the shadow of the Theban obelisks. We recall how traffic with Babylonia had taught these Western Semites to write the cuneiform hand. To the caravan coming out of Egypt, Palestine was the entrance to the bridge between Africa and Asia, a middle ground where the civilizations of Egypt and Babylonia, Phoenicia, the Aegean, and the highland zone, all represented by their wares, met and commingled as they did nowhere else in the ancient Near East. Just as the merchandise of the surrounding nations met in peaceful competition in the markets of Palestine, so the armies of these nations also met there in battle. The situation of Palestine between its powerful neighbors on the Nile and on the Euphrates made it the battleground where these great nations fought for many centuries. Over and over again, unhappy Palestine went through the experience of Little Belgium in the conflict between Germany and France in 1914. For many centuries, Egypt held Palestine as a subject country, and you will hear it in the appropriate video. We recall how Assyria later conquered it and Chaldea enslaved it, and we shall yet find it in the power of Persia. And it is amazing because it was Persia that actually left the Jews, the Hebrews, go out of captivity back to Palestine. It's full of amazing things I didn't know. I find it really fascinating. Anyway, when therefore the Hebrews originally took possession of the land, there was little prospect that they would ever long enjoy freedom from foreign oppression. What they found there were nomads, and the Hebrews, when they got to Palestine, it was already occupied by other Semitic tribes. The Semitic race had many different tribes at the time, and the ones in Palestine were the Canaanites and the Amorites, I believe, but I'm running away with myself. Let me continue because I really don't want to make mistakes here. Okay, so the settlement of the Hebrews in Palestine and the united Hebrew kingdom. The Hebrews were all originally men of the Arabian desert, wandering with their flocks and herds and slowly drifting over into their final home in Palestine. For 2 centuries, about 1400 to 1200 BC, their movement from the desert into Palestine continued. Another group of their tribes had been enslaved in Egypt, where they had suffered much hardship under a cruel Pharaoh. They were successfully led out of Egypt by their heroic leader Moses, a great national hero whose achievements his people never forgot. On entering Palestine, the Hebrews found the Canaanites already dwelling there in flourishing towns protected by massive walls. The Hebrews were able to capture only the weaker Canaanite towns. As the rough Hebrew shepherds looked across the highlands of northern Palestine, they beheld their kindred, the ones that hadn't been slaves, scattered over far-stretching hilltops with the frowning walls of many a Canaanite stronghold rising between them. Even Jerusalem in the Judean highlands for centuries defied the assaults of the Hebrew invaders, who had no siege machinery for attacking city walls. Let us remember that by that time, these unconquered Palestinian towns possessed a civilization 1,500 years old, with comfortable houses, government, industries, trade, writing, and religion, a civilization which the rude Hebrew shepherds were soon adopting, for they could not avoid intercourse with the unsubdued Canaanite towns as trade and business threw them together. This mingling with the Canaanites produced the most profound changes in the life of the Hebrews. Most of them left their tents and began to build houses like those of the Canaanites. They put off the rough sheepskin they had worn in the desert, and they put on fine Canaanite raiment of gaily colored woven wool. After a time, in appearance, occupation, and manner of life, the Hebrews were not to be distinguished from the Canaanites among whom they lived. In short, they had adopted Canaanite civilization just as newly arrived immigrants among us soon adopt our clothing and our ways. These changes did not proceed everywhere at the same rate. In the less fertile south, the Hebrews were more attached to the old desert life, so that many would not give up the tent and the old freedom of the desert. The wandering life of the nomad shepherd on the Judean hills could still be seen from the walls of Jerusalem. Here, then, were two different modes of life among the Hebrews. In the fertile north of Palestine, we find the settled life of the town and its outlying fields. In the south, on the other hand, the wandering life of the nomad still went on. For centuries, this difference formed an important cause of discord among the Hebrews. Fortunately for the Hebrews, Egypt was in a state of decline by 1100 BC, and Assyria had not yet conquered the west. But a Mediterranean people called Philistines had at this time migrated from the island of Crete to the sea plain at the southwest corner of Palestine. These Philistines formed a highly civilized and warlike nation, or group of city kingdoms. Hard-pressed by the Philistines, the Hebrew local leaders, or judges as they were called, found it no easy task to unite their people into a nation. About a generation before the year 1000 BC, however, a popular leader named Saul succeeded in gaining for himself the office of king. The new king was a southerner who still loved the old nomad customs. He was not fond of a fixed abode and preferred to dwell in a tent. In a fierce struggle to thrust back the Philistines, Saul was disastrously defeated, and seeing the rout of his army, he fell upon his own sword and so died. In a few years, the ability of David, one of Saul's daring men-at-arms, whom he had just unjustly outlawed, won the support of the south. Seeing the importance, David about 1000 to 960 BC. Seeing the importance of possessing a strong castle, the sagacious David selected the ancient fortress on the steep hill of Jerusalem, hitherto held by the Canaanites. The oldest occurrence of the name of the place has recently been found in Egyptian writings over 1,000 years older than David's time. He took possession of the venerable city and made it his residence. Here he ruled for a time as king of the south, till his valor as a soldier and his victories on all sides won him also the support of the more prosperous north. The Philistines were now beaten off, and David ruled over an extensive Hebrew kingdom. He enjoyed a long and prosperous reign, and his people never forgot his heroic deeds as a warrior or his skill as a poet and singer. David's son, Solomon, became like Hammurabi, a fascinating king from Mesopotamia. Like Hammurabi, one of the leading merchants of the East. He trafficked in horses and launched a trading fleet in partnership with Hiram, the Phoenician king of Tyre. His wealth enabled him to marry a daughter of the king of Egypt, and he delighted in Oriental luxury and display. He removed the portable tent which the Hebrews had thus far used as a temple, and with the aid of his friend Hiram, who lent him skilled Phoenician workmen, he built a rich temple of stone in Jerusalem. Such splendor demanded a great income, and to secure it he weighed down the Hebrews with heavy taxes. The resultant discontent of his subjects was so great that under Solomon's son, the northern tribes withdrew from the nation and set up a king of their own. Thus the Hebrew nation was divided into two kingdoms before it was a century old. The two Hebrew kingdoms. There was much hard feeling between the two Hebrew kingdoms and sometimes fighting. Israel, as we call the northern kingdom, was rich and prosperous. Its marketplaces were filled with industry and commerce. Its fertile fields produced plentiful crops. Israel displayed the wealth and success of town life. On the other hand, Judah, the southern kingdom, was poor. Its land was meager. Besides Jerusalem, it had no large towns. Many of the people still wandered with their flocks. These two methods of life came into conflict in many ways, but especially in religion. Every old Canaanite town for centuries had had its local town god, called its Baal or Lord. The Hebrew townsmen therefore found it very natural to worship the gods of their neighbors, the Canaanite townsmen. They were thus unfaithful to their old Hebrew god Yahweh. To some devout Hebrews, therefore, and especially to those in the south, The Canaanite gods seemed to be the protectors of the wealthy class in the towns, with their luxury and injustice to the poor, while Yahweh appeared as the guardian of the simpler shepherd life of the desert, and therefore the protector of the poor and needy. There was growing reason for such beliefs. Less than a century after the separation of the two kingdoms, Ahab, a king of the north, had Naboth, one of his subjects, killed in order to seize a vineyard belonging to Naboth and thus to enlarge his palace gardens. Reports of such wrongs stirred the anger of Elijah, a Hebrew of old nomad habits who lived in the desert east of the Jordan. Still wearing his desert sheepskin, he suddenly appeared before Ahab in the ill-gotten vineyard and denounced the king for his seizure of it. Thus, this uncouth figure from the desert proclaimed war between Yahweh and the injustice of town life. Elijah's followers finally slew not only the entire northern royal family, but also the priests of the Canaanite gods, or Baals. Such violent methods, however, could not accomplish lasting good. They were the methods of Hebrews who thought of Yahweh only as a war god. Besides such violent leaders as these, there were also among the Hebrews more peaceable men who likewise chafed under the injustice of town life. These turned fondly back to the grand old days of their shepherd wanderings, out on the broad reaches of the desert, where no man ground the faces of the poor. This point of view is picturesquely set forth in a simple narrative history of the Hebrew forefathers, a glorified picture of their shepherd life as we find it in the immortal tales of the Hebrew patriarchs, of Abraham and Isaac, of Jacob and Joseph. These tales belong among the noblest literature which has survived to us from the past. We should notice also that they are the earliest example of historical writing in prose, of finished literary style which we have inherited from any people. It is now quite clear that such men were acquainted with the papyrus rolls written by Egyptian social reformers over 1,000 years earlier in defense of the poor and the helpless. We now know that such Egyptian documents were sometimes translated into Hebrew, for an Egyptian roll has been found containing a collection of wise proverbs, a section of which was included in the book of Proverbs and later circulated under the name of Solomon. As they read such writings of the old Egyptian champions of the poor, the Hebrew prophets and reformers took courage and gained new ideas. Another century passed, and about 750 BC, another dingy figure in sheepskin appeared in the streets of Bethel, where the northern kingdom had an important temple. It was Amos, a shepherd from the hills of Judah in the south. In the solitudes of his shepherd life, Amos had learned to see in Yahweh far more than a war god of the desert. To him, Yahweh seemed to be a god of fatherly kindness, not demanding bloody butchery like that practiced by Elijah's followers, but nevertheless a God who rebuked the selfish and oppressive wealthy class of the towns. The simple shepherd could not resist the inner impulse to journey to the northern kingdom and proclaim to the luxurious townsmen there the evils of their manner of life. We can imagine the surprise of the prosperous northern Hebrews as they suddenly met this rude shepherd figure, clad in sheepskin, standing at the street corner, addressing a crowd of townsmen. He was denouncing their showy clothes, fine houses, beautiful furniture, and above all their corrupt lives and hard-heartedness towards the poor among their fellow Hebrews, whose lands they seize for debt and whose labor they gain by enslaving them. These things had been unknown in the desert. By such addresses as these, Amos, of course, endangered his life, but he thus became the first social reformer in Asia. We apply the term prophet to the great Hebrew leaders who pointed out the way towards unselfish living, brotherly kindness, and a higher type of religion. Thus began in Western Asia the same kind of effort to lead men to show justice and kindness toward all, especially toward the poor, which had long been known in Egypt, and it is probable that Amos had heard of such Egyptian teachings. This is difficult to believe because what we know of Egypt is the pharaohs and all the luxury and so on. But as I said, it's fascinating how they actually had a religion which didn't last too long, but in which they first thought of the universal God, who would be just to all. Amazing. And they called him the Good Shepherd. This is the Egyptian. You have to look at all the videos, really. All right, let me continue. Fearing that his teachings might be lost if they remained merely spoken words, Amos finally sat down and put his sermons into writings, and thus they have survived to us. While all this had been going on, the Hebrews had been learning to write, and so many of their nomad predecessors on the Fertile Crescent had done before them. They were now abandoning the clay tablet and wrote on papyrus with the Egyptian pen and ink. They borrowed their alphabet from the Phoenician and Aramean merchants. It is certain that our earliest Hebrew historian's admiration for the nomad life did not prevent him from making use of this new and great convenience of town life, that is, writing. The rolls containing the beautiful tales of the patriarchs or bearing the teachings of such men as Amos were the first books which the Hebrews produced, their first literature. Such rolls of papyrus were exactly like those which had been in use in Egypt for over 2,000 years. The discovery of the household papers of a Hebrew community in Egypt has shown us that just how such a page of Hebrew or Aramaic writing looked like. But literature remained the only art the Hebrews possessed. They had no painting, sculpture, or architecture, and if they needed these things, they borrowed from their great neighbors, Egypt, Phoenicia, Damascus, and Assyria. The destruction of the Hebrew kingdoms by Assyria and Chaldea. Okay, remember this is in Mesopotamia. Okay, in the eastern part, while the Hebrews had been deeply stirred by their own conflicts at home, Such men as Amos had also perceived and proclaimed the dangers coming from abroad, from beyond the borders of Palestine, especially Assyria. Amos indeed announced the coming destruction of the northern kingdom by Assyria because of the evil lives of the people. As Amos had foreseen, Assyria first swept away Damascus. The kingdom of Israel, left thus exposed, was the next victim, and Samaria, its capital, was captured by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Of the unhappy northern Hebrews, 27,290 well-to-do people were carried away as captives, and the northern nation, called Israel, was destroyed after having existed for a little over 2 centuries. The national hopes of the Hebrews were now centered in the helpless little kingdom of Judah, which struggled on for over a century and a quarter more in the midst of a great world conflict in which Assyria was the unchallenged champion. Thus far, thoughtful Hebrews had been accustomed to think of their God as ruling in Palestine only, but now they were learning that Palestine was part of a great political world. Did he have power also over the vast world arena where all the mighty nations were fighting? This was a question that the Egyptians themselves also asked of their gods, whether they, after they had the empire, whether their God would actually rule over the whole empire. Same question. But if so, was not Assur, the great god of victorious Assyria, stronger than Yahweh, God of the Hebrews? And many a despairing Hebrew, as he looked out over the hills of Palestine, wasted by the armies of Assyria, felt in his heart that Assur, the god of the victorious Assyrians, who ruled nearly all Western Asia, must indeed be stronger than Yahweh, God of the Hebrews. It was in the midst of somber doubts like this, in the years before 700 BC, that the princely prophet Isaiah, in one great oration after another, addressed the multitudes which filled the streets of Jerusalem. The hosts of Sennacherib were at the gates, and the terrified throngs in the city were expecting at any moment to hear the thunder of the great Assyrian war engines battering down the crumbling walls of their city as they had crushed the walls of Damascus and Samaria. Then the bold words of the dauntless Isaiah lifted them from despair like the triumphant call of a trumpet. He told them that Yahweh ruled a kingdom far larger than Palestine, that he controlled the great world arena, where he, and not Assur, was the triumphant champion. If the Assyrians had wasted and plundered Palestine, it was because they were but the lash in the hands of Yahweh, who was using them as a scourge in his own hands to punish Judah for its wrongdoing. Thus, while the people were momentarily expecting the destruction of Jerusalem, Isaiah undoubtedly proclaimed a great and glorious future for the Hebrews and speedy disaster for the Assyrians. When at length A pestilence from the marshes of the eastern Nile delta swept away the army of Sennacherib and saved Jerusalem. It seemed to the Hebrews that the destroying angel of Yahweh who had smitten the Assyrian host. Some of the Hebrews then began to see that Yahweh ruled a larger world than Palestine. Their own ideas were stimulated by the great sun hymn of Ignaton. That's another king from Mesopotamia, which had long been circulating in Western Asia, as one of the Hebrew Psalms shows. Compare these two passages. From Ignaton's sun hymn: "How manifold are thy works! They are hidden before men, O sole God, beside whom there is no other. Thou didst create the earth according to thy will." And compare that from the 104th Psalm: "O Lord, how manifold are thy works! In wisdom hast thou made them all. The earth is full of thy riches." Nearly a century after the deliverance from Sennacherib, they beheld and rejoiced over the destruction of Nineveh. And they fondly hoped that the fall of Assyria meant final deliverance from foreign oppression. But they had only exchanged one foreign lord for another, and Chaldea followed Assyria in control of Palestine. Then the unsubmissive Hebrews of Judah met the same fate which their kindred of Israel had suffered. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldean king, destroyed Jerusalem and carried away the people to exile in Babylonia. The Hebrew nation, both north and south, was thus wiped out after having existed about 4.5 centuries. The Hebrews in exile and their deliverance by the Persians. Some of the fugitives fled to Egypt. Among them was the melancholy prophet Jeremiah, who had foreseen the coming destruction of Jerusalem with its temple of Yahweh. He strove to teach his people that each must regard his own heart as a temple of Yahweh, which would endure long after his temple in Jerusalem had crashed into ruin. Recent excavation has restored to us the actual papers of a colony of Hebrews in Egypt at Elephantine. These papers show that the exiled Hebrews in Egypt had not yet reached Jeremiah's ideal of a temple of Yahweh in every human heart, for they had built a temple of their own in which they carried on the worship of Yahweh. Similarly, the Hebrew exiles in Babylonia were not yet convinced of the truth of the teaching they had heard from their great leaders, the prophets. They were at first only grief and unanswered questionings, of which the echo still reaches us. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remember Zion, Jerusalem. Upon the willows in the midst thereof we hanged up our harps. How shall we sing Yahweh's song in a strange land? And this is from Psalms 137, 1-4. Had they not left Yahweh behind in Palestine? And then arose a wonderful teacher among the Hebrew exiles, and out of centuries of affliction gave them the answer. In a series of triumphant speeches, this greatest of the earlier Hebrews declared Yahweh to be the creator and sole God of the universe. He explained to his fellow exiles that suffering and affliction were the best possible training and discipline to prepare a people for service. He announced, therefore, He announced, therefore, that by afflicting them, Yahweh was only preparing his suffering people for service to the world, and that he would yet restore them and enable them to fulfill a great mission to all men. He greeted the sudden rise of Cyrus the Persian with joy. All kings, he taught, were but instruments in the hands of Yahweh, who through the Persians would overthrow the Chaldeans and return the Hebrews to their land. Thus had the Hebrew vision of Yahweh slowly grown from the days of their nomad life, when they had seen him only as a fierce tribal war god, having no power beyond the corner of the desert where they lived, until now, when they had come to see that he was a kindly father and a righteous ruler of all the earth. This was monotheism, a belief which made Yahweh the sole God. They had reached it only through a long development which brought them suffering and disaster, a discipline lasting many centuries. Just as the individual today, especially a young person, learns from his mistakes and develops character as he suffers for his own errors, so the suffering Hebrews had outgrown many imperfect ideas. They thus illustrated the words of the greatest of the Hebrew teachers. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. Those are the words of Jesus, Mark 4:28. By this rich and wonderful experience of the Hebrews in religious progress, the whole world was yet to profit. When the victorious Persian king Cyrus entered Babylon, the Hebrew exiles there greeted him as their deliverer. His triumph gave the Hebrews a Persian ruler. With great humanity, the Persian kings allowed the exiles to return to their native land. Some had prospered in Babylonia and did not care to return, but at different times enough of them went back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city on a very modest scale and to restore the temple. The authority given by the Persian government to the returned Hebrew leaders enabled them to establish and publish the religious laws which have ever since been revered by the Jews. The religion thus organized by the returned Hebrew leaders we now call Judaism, the religion of the Jews. Under it, the old Hebrew kinship was not revived. In its place, a high priest at Jerusalem became the ruler of the Jews. The Jewish state was thus a religious organization, a church with a priest at its head. The leaders of this church devoted themselves to the study of the ancient writings of their race still surviving in their hands. A number of the old writings, some of them mentioned in the Old Testament, had been lost. They arranged and copied the orations and addresses of the prophets and all the old Hebrew writings they possessed. As time went on and the service of the restored temple developed, they arranged the remarkable book of 150 religious songs, the hymn book of the Second Temple, known to us as the Book of Psalms. For a long time, indeed for centuries, these various Hebrew books, such as the Law, the Prophets, and the Psalms, circulated in separate rolls, and it did not occur to anyone to put them together to form one book. It was not until Christian times that the Jewish leaders put all these old writings of their fathers together to form one book. Printed in Hebrew as they were originally written, they formed the Bible of the Jews at the present day. These Hebrew writings have also become a sacred book of Christian nations. In the form of an English translation, it is called the Old Testament, and is today the most precious legacy which we have inherited from the ancient Near East before the coming of Christ. It tells the story of how a rude shepherd folk issued from the wilds of the Arabian desert to live in Palestine, where they were prepared to understand the religious writings of the earlier great nations of the East, especially Egypt, and thus to pass through experiences which made them the religious teachers of the civilized world. And we should further remember that, crowning all their history, there came forth from them in due time the founder of the Christian religion. One of the most important things that we owe to the Persians, therefore, that's Iran, was their restoration of the Hebrews to Palestine. The Persians thus saved and aided in transmitting to us the great legacy from Hebrew life which we have in the Old Testament and in the life of the founder of Christianity. Okay, so this is the chapter on the Hebrews. I will post the one on the Egyptians, extremely interesting, and the ones on the Chaldeans and the Assyrians, and you will see the connection here. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.